This movie is about leading, which is the space between the lines or interline spacing. Called leading because in the days of metal type, it used to be achieved with thin strips of lead. We're talking about the distance from one baseline of type to the next baseline of type. And if you ever need to measure the leading on a printed piece, you can use this special ruler referred to as a leading gauge, and you can find these in graphic supply stores. By default, the leading is set to 120% or auto leading. And when you see the leading value in parentheses, that means auto leading. You can change the percentage if you want to in the justification dialog. The benefit of auto leading is that as your type gets bigger, so too does your leading. As your type gets smaller, so too does your leading. But auto leading has some drawbacks, and we'll look at those in a moment. So in general, I would recommend not using auto leading, but for your body text, for your continuous reading type, going for between +1 and +3 points. So in this particular case, I have 16-point type with 18-point leading. Why not use auto leading? Well, as your type gets bigger, that proportion of 120% just becomes too much. That's especially the case when working with type that's in all caps. On the left, the lines are just too far apart and the headline loses its impact. Then there are some technical issues with auto leading because it is 120% not of the paragraph, but literally of the biggest character in the paragraph. And that might be by mistake, it's a very easy mistake to make, a single character that is bigger than the rest. And that's the case here, where I have a word space that is larger than the rest of the type. And that means that this line has more leading on it than the other lines. And the thing about leading is we always want it to be consistent. But auto leading isn't all bad. In fact, sometimes it's essential. When you're working with inline graphics, pictures that have been inserted into the text flow and move along with the text, then you need auto leading. I'll press W to turn on my guides. So I'm going to move these pictures just out of the way. Now, these are not currently inline graphics. To make them such, I am going to create a blank paragraph just before where they should be inserted. And I need to make sure that that blank paragraph is set to auto leading. Let's see what happens if it's not, first of all. If I just drag this into position, holding down the Shift key, if I hover over that blue square, drag into text to anchor object, Shift drag to make an inline object. So that's what I'm going to do, Shift drag, and you can see it's not going to work. It's just that line that I've dragged it onto is fixed, in this case at 14 point. But if I make that line auto leading, it's going to be 120%. 120% in this case of the height of the image. I can take that further and make it into a paragraph style, which gives me a bit more control, and I can now apply that paragraph style to the other paragraph and then select the other image, hold down the Shift key, drag from that blue square. Now, because it's a paragraph style, if I decide I want a bit more space, I could just come and edit that style and maybe come to indents and spacing, and I'll just add a little bit more space above each of those images. Let's look at leading shortcuts and preferences. Useful shortcut is if you want to reduce the leading, Option or Alt and the up arrow to increase the leading, Option or Alt, and the down arrow. Now, when you use that keyboard shortcut, currently I'm going in increments of 2 points. But if I want to change that, I can come to my preferences, to my units and increments preferences, and it's this option right here. So if I want tighter control, I might want to reduce that number to 1 point. A couple of preferences that relate to leading. Skip by leading. So in this particular scenario, we have an image to which is applied a text wrap. And it is that text wrap that is forcing the text to jump the image. But when the text resumes, we see that it's out of sync in terms of its baseline with the text in column 1. Let's just draw down a guide right there, and we can see that the baselines are not lining up. Well, if I were to come to my preferences and to composition, I could choose skip by leading, and you see that fixes the problem. Now, if you're working with a baseline grid, which is a topic that I talk about later in this course, this preference isn't necessary. And in fact, I don't tend to use this preference. I'm just pointing out to you. The other option that we have in terms of preferences is apply to entire paragraphs. We saw how we can run into problems with auto leading because you have different sizes within the same paragraph, which might create problems. But if you were to turn on this preference, apply leading to entire paragraphs, already turned on, that means that if I increase the leading on this one line, it's going to affect the whole paragraph, not just that line. So why would you not want to use that all the time? Well, here's a case when you might not want to use that. So I now need to come and turn that preference off, because it will prevent you from using what's referred to as optical leading. Occasionally, it's not often, but occasionally you may find yourself in a situation where it appears that there is more leading between certain lines than others, even though the leading value is the same. And that's because, in this case, this word has no descenders. There are no parts of the character going beneath the baseline, so optically it looks closer to the line that precedes it. Well, we can address this on a case-by-case basis. It's only something that you'd want to do with display type by selecting this line and then just nudging it up a fraction using that keyboard shortcut, Option or Alt, and the up arrow. A few things to consider when working with leading. If you are working with very wide columns, you might want to increase the size of your leading just to compensate for the width of the column. When you're working with multiple columns, make sure that the gutter width, the space between the columns, is around the same value as the leading. We don't want it to be too much, as in the middle example, where the two columns look detached from each other, and we don't want it to be too small, because then there's the danger that the eye will jump from column 1 to column 2 rather than continue down the line. If you're working with type that reverses out of a solid color, you might compensate for that slightly reduced readability by making the type a bolder weight. Here I've gone from regular to semi-bold. And if you're working with type that has a high X height, the example on the right, Museo Sans, an example of a typeface with a high X height, the relative size of the lowercase characters, then you want a little bit more leading than you would if you were working with a typeface where, and here's the opposite scenario, a typeface that has a low X height, where you might want to reduce the leading, as I have in the example on the right. As mentioned before, if you are working with text in all uppercase, you definitely want to bring the lines closer together. So I'm going to select the type here. It's currently auto leading. We can see that the leading value is in parentheses. The lines are too far apart. If I press Option or Alt and my up arrow, I can bring them closer together. Now I may even get into what's referred to as negative leading, where the leading value is actually less than the point size.